You are listening to 106.7 Wilmington's Big Talker, and my name is Paul Vallone. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of people from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. In today's episode, we have as our honored guest Chris Bird, the author of The Concealed Handgun Manual, and most recently, a very relevant book and timely, How to Survive a Mass Killer Rampage. But first, let's take a quick look at the week's gun rights news. Details continue to emerge on the mass murder in Las Vegas on October 1st, in which 58 people were killed and 489 were injured when a cold-blooded killer with nearly 24 weapons rained death from the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay Casino onto 22,000 concertgoers at the Route 91 Harvest Festival. Media accounts have begun to claim he used a bump fire system to elevate his weapon's rate of fire. What we do know about this has caused some to conjecture that the incident seems almost too tailor-made for gun control. We have here a white male, motives unknown, using exactly the types of weapons and magazines that gun control advocates have been trying to ban, which were legally modified for an even higher rate of fire. And he was shooting from the 32nd floor, approximately 400 yards from the concert venue, making him impervious to return fire from either police or concealed handgun permit holders. Now, left-wingers wasted no time in putting to use Rahm Emanuel's axiom to never let a good tragedy go to waste. Gun control organizations immediately began demanding so-called universal background checks, despite the fact that the killer had no criminal background and purchased a gun from a licensed dealer after a background check just days before the shootings. Hillary Clinton, of course, blames you. When asked whether Republicans and the NRA were culpable for this, she answered, "Of course." And, of course, then we have Senator Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, who has renewed his calls for bans on the semi-automatic firearms, which in a modern era probably comprise most gun sales. Of course, the left-wingers who call you a racist immediately played the race card against what they call white man's rage. Indeed, the headline of one online publication, Vox, screamed that, and I quote, "White American men are a bigger domestic terrorist threat than Muslim foreigners," end quote. The low-hanging fruit for gun ban advocates is undoubtedly the bump fire system. Media hyperbole notwithstanding, however, there's nothing magical about that system. All it really does is to allow the finger to manipulate the trigger more rapidly. Now, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives reviewed the bump fire system in 2010 and declined to regulate it because the mechanism did not qualify as a machine gun under the National Firearms Act of 1934. In fact, by virtue of the fact that the gun actually moves in the shooter's hand, bump fire mechanisms actually make it impossible for a shooter to aim accurately, making the system pretty much useless for mass killing in any situation other than being in a shooting position 32 floors above a crowded mass of people whom the shooter could not possibly miss. Now, you might be forgiven for assuming that with a Republican president and Congress, gun rights supporters have nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, you would be wrong. The first thing we are seeing is the halt of any pro-gun legislation in Congress and quite possibly in state legislatures, including North Carolina. Now, with gun control advocates falsely claiming that a sound suppressor, which they misleadingly call a silencer, they claim it would have exacerbated the Las Vegas shootings. So Speaker Paul Ryan, Republican of Wisconsin, has reportedly pulled the SHARE Act, which would essentially make it easier to get sound suppressors. He's pulled that legislation from the calendar in the United States House. Meanwhile, a number of Republicans have told the media they would look at the so-called loophole through which the media is claiming semi-automatic firearms can fire like machine guns, including Newt Gingrich and, interestingly, our own Congressman Mark Meadows, the vocal conservative who has become increasingly prominent in the United States House. This is according to the Washington Post, and I quote, "You have to have a special class of license to have an automatic weapon," said Mark Meadows, Republican, North Carolina, chairman of the Freedom Caucus. And so if this is something to bypass this, I think it's become something we obviously need to look at in the future. So worst of all, some Republicans appear to be colluding with Dianne Feinstein. Says USA Today, and I quote, "Some key Republicans are showing interest in a narrowly written Democrat gun control bill to ban bump stock rifle attachments that enable rapid firing. The bill will be offered by Senator Dianne Feinstein, the Senate Judiciary Committee's top-ranking Democrat." Here we go again. Remember the Toomey Manchin compromise for Senate Bill 649, the so-called universal background check bill? Yeah. We may or may not have support from Republicans. We may or may not have support from the NRA. We're going to have to see. But by the way, this is where we should stop to pause and thank House Majority Whip Steve Scalise, Republican of Louisiana, for standing strong for gun rights even after being shot by a leftist. In fact, in an interview with Fox News, Scalise said his victimization has actually fortified his support for the Second Amendment. Bravo. So in coming weeks, you're going to have to get involved yet again in killing federal gun control. Almost certainly. Almost certainly it will supposedly target bump fire systems, but I can guarantee you that when you look at the language, it will encompass far, far more, and probably will encompass high-capacity magazines, or what we should really call standard capacity magazines, and probably also many of the features, the cosmetic features, which were banned in 1994 in the so-called assault weapons ban. Now, for your use, here are some facts. Okay, as I recently relayed them to a reporter for a major national publication. In France, where guns are almost entirely banned, it's very difficult to own firearms in France, recent mass homicides have killed more than the 58 people who died in Las Vegas. Specifically, on November 13th of 2015, terrorists in Paris killed 137 people and wounded 368 people in attacks using explosives and illegal machine guns. Now, the rule there is if you're going to smuggle in an illegal firearm, it might as well be a machine gun. And in fact, this is the first use of a near fully automatic weapon in the United States, It's actually been used many times in Europe. And then on July 14th, terrorists in Nice killed 86 and wounded 434 using a cargo truck. So if terrorist violence in France and elsewhere proves anything, it is that weapons are irrelevant. The problem isn't the weapons used by deviants. It is the deviants themselves. But we'll talk more about that at the end of the show. Meanwhile, we're going to take a short break, and you have been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Join us after the break when we resume with our guest Chris Bird and his book, Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Today we have as our honored guest, Chris Bird, who wrote the book Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage, especially timely. Chris is the author of the Concealed Handgun Manual as well, and the most recent book, How to Survive a Mass Killer Rampage, I believe has an addendum. Let's see, when seconds count, police are only minutes away, which could not be more true and something I have said many times. Chris has been a journalist for 35 years and a handgun shooter for more than 50. Born in England, his interest in shooting has steered him through the bureaucratic red tape of owning handguns in England, God help him, Canada, Australia, and the United States. As a commissioned officer in the Royal Military Police of the British Army, Bird was stationed in Berlin and Belgium, serving as company weapon training officer and winning awards for shooting in competition. He became a journalist and worked as a crime and investigative reporter for the Vancouver Province newspaper and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He is also a former police reporter for the San Antonio Express News. Welcome, Chris.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Paul.
Well, your book is, as you've noted, probably getting Googled a lot right now, and I think you said you're busy doing bunches of interviews as the world beats a path to your door, given the events of last Sunday.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to agree with you.
Okay. The full title, the title of the book was Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. When seconds count, police are only minutes away. The last part of the title in particular says it all. Tell us what inspired you to write this book.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm the author of the Concealed Handgun Manual, and in the 6th edition, the first chapter I devoted to mass killings and how to cope with them, and then I thought, with the way things were going, that it merited a book all on its own. So, hence the new book, Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage.
So what particular rampages? I know you cover a number of them in the book, and can you give us some examples of what's covered and maybe what was learned in some of those?
Well, the first one I deal with is the shooting from the tower at the University of Texas in Austin, and that was 51 years ago. That resulted in the creation of SWAT teams because police departments kind of realized that they didn't really have any way of coping successfully with mass shooters. The shooter in that case was brought down, but it took rather a long time. And it was a couple of officers operating basically on their own initiative with some assistance from a civilian who did that. Then when Columbine came along, we discovered that SWAT teams were not the answer. The shooting there was done in about the first 10 minutes. And an ad hoc SWAT team made up of different organizations finally went in there 45 minutes after the shooting started, and obviously way too late to help any of the people who were in there. There was several officers who were outside, and they were told to maintain a perimeter, and they could hear the shooting going on, and kids were dying, but they were told to stay out and wait for the SWAT team. After that, they decided that, well, maybe the first 3 or 4 officers would form an entry team and go in when they arrived, not waiting for the SWAT team. That appeared to be what was used at the San Bernardino shooting, where there were 2 terrorists who were shooting up a Christmas party. And the first guy on the scene was a lieutenant who was going to lunch. And he said, I waited 2 minutes until 3 more officers arrived, and by the time they went in, it was all over, and the perpetrators had escaped. They were killed later, but that didn't do any good to the people who had become victims at that point.
2 minutes, wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, a friend of mine who used to be police officer in Ohio, and has a database of at least a couple of hundred of these mass shooting incidents, says that on average, a mass killer will shoot and wound or kill between 4 and 5 people a minute. And so if you've got 2 terrorists like you have in San Bernardino, that 2 minutes can cost you 20 people, either killed or wounded. And of course, the most recent example, I think he was obviously shooting a lot more than 4 or 5 people a minute, but that's an exception to the rule. Nowadays, the smart police departments and sheriff's offices are saying first officer on the scene goes in immediately. Mm-hmm. And however, we listened at the Gun Rights Policy Conference a year ago to Sheriff Wayne Ivey of Brevard County in Florida, not far from Orlando. And he said, when we get an active shooter call, we will respond at Mach 2 with our hair on fire, his words, but we will arrive too late. So the best thing I can do is teach my residents how to defend themselves until we can get there. And he put together a program, an 8-hour program, teaching people how to do just that. And he was booked up at that stage for a year.
That's impressive, actually. Not very many law enforcement officers are that, I guess, forward-thinking on teaching people to defend themselves. A few, without a doubt, are recommending concealed handguns after San Bernardino and some of the other killings, but that is actually very impressive.
Yeah, I guess after San Bernardino, there were several sheriffs around the country who urged their residents to get licensed to carry concealed and to carry. One of them was Paul Van Blockum, sheriff of Ulster County in upstate New York, and he put it on his Facebook page: if you have a concealed handgun license, please carry. And nice. He received some flack from Bill Bratton, who at the time was the commissioner of the New York City Police Department. And Van Blockum's response to me was, he said, Bill Bratton has no opinions. his opinion is whatever the mayor says it is. And that I thought that was a very good explanation of the difference between a sheriff and a police chief. A police chief has to pander to the city council and the mayor, whereas a sheriff has to get elected by the people. And so there tends to be a difference there.
It's interesting. Yeah, I've noticed the same thing. Police chiefs are bureaucrats. They don't answer to voters, and consequently, they tend to be much more in favor of gun control than elected sheriffs. So we're going to take a break in a few minutes, but first, I want to talk a little bit about what you recommend for concealed handgun permit holders in terms of their preparation. Okay, briefly speaking.
Well, the main thing, I guess, in most jurisdictions, you need to get a concealed handgun license. Although I support open carry, as we now have in Texas just recently, I do not practice it. I think the gun should be a surprise to the bad guy. And if you're wearing it in the open, you can have it taken away from you.
Here. I've said that actually many times. I don't want the guy to know I'm armed until his knowledge is a moot point. Listen, we're going to have to take a break, and we're going to resume this after we come back. You have been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Join us after the break when we resume with our guest Chris Bird and his book, Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Today we have as our guest Chris Bird and his book, Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. We were talking about precautions that people should take before they get into these situations, Chris. And I'm sorry, I had to interrupt you. Continue, please. Tell us what else they should be doing.
Well, a lot of people will get a concealed handgun license and think that, okay, I'm ready, I can defend myself, I've got the gun. Nothing could be further from the truth in a way. You really need to go beyond the minimal training that you get, if any, to get that license. They're more concerned with the law and the rules as far as concealed carry in your particular state is concerned. But you need, if at all possible, to take some courses and to practice regularly, because handgun shooting in particular is a perishable skill. And if you don't practice, your skill will deteriorate. And particularly if you're looking at instances of mass shooters, you may well have to take decisions like, this guy could be wearing a suicide vest. I have to hit him in the head. I'm 50 feet away. Can I do that? Am I good enough? You've got to practice realistically. There's a lot of good teachers, fortunately, that around the country who hold courses. I'm going
to put in a plug here for a guy who's been great. Are you familiar with John Farnham at all?
Oh, yes, yes, indeed.
Yeah, John goes around the country, and I have taken 2 of his courses that are the first and the advanced level of armed response to a terrorist attack. I heartily recommend his stuff.
Yes, I've never met him, but we've talked on the telephone, and he's actually read some of my books and given me positive feedback on them. So he's well known in the industry. You couldn't do better than take a course from him. But that's one thing that you need to do. You were also talking on the break about how to avoid getting shot by law enforcement. because one thing that you don't want to do is when the police start to arrive, to be standing there. You've just shot the bad guy. You're standing there with a gun pointed at him, and you may well consider that from the policeman's point of view, you may be the bad guy. And there's been some instances where, well, there was one case here in Texas where a guy, Vic Stacy, was lived in an RV park. There was a guy there who got along with nobody. He eventually got into a hassle with a couple because their dogs, he said, were pooping around his trailer. So on a Sunday afternoon, he went back to his trailer, got a 9mm, shot and killed the husband, shot and killed the wife, and shot both dogs. And then somebody called 911. The first police officer that came in and stopped about 40 yards away from Connor. Connor by now had a .30-30 with a scope on it, rifle, and he started shooting at the police officer. Well, Vic Stacy had been called, and he was 57 yards away at an angle where the bad guy was exposed, and he had a Colt Python 357 Magnum.
Nice choice.
He fired the first shot, hit the guy in the thigh, knocked him down, and then he and the police officer finished the guy off because he was still shooting or attempting to shoot. When more police officers arrived, I was able to get the dash cam video. And although you can't see Vic Stacy on it, you can hear the police officers yelling, drop the gun, put the gun down, repeatedly. And eventually a Department of Public Safety trooper went over with a rifle and put him on the ground, put him in handcuffs, and until they'd sorted out what exactly happened and who
Which
was
is
the bad
pretty
guy.
much what somebody can expect. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you can expect to be put down and handcuffed.
Yes. That should not come as a surprise. There was another case that was handled perhaps a little better from that point of view, with a preacher, pastor, just south of Orlando, and he was firing his maintenance man, suspected of some kind of theft, I think. And he explained to the guy, he was in his office with his daughter, who was also a pastor, and his office manager, and the maintenance man. The maintenance man said, well, are you going to fire me over this? And the pastor says, yes. Immediately, and they were across the desk from each other. Immediately, the maintenance man pulls out a gun, a .45, and shoots it almost into the face of the pastor. Incredibly, he missed. Fortunately, the pastor was wearing glasses because he certainly had powder burns on his face, but his eyes were saved by the fact that he was wearing glasses. He realized that the pastor, that is, realized that he had a gun, and the two women attacked this guy, and then they ran off, thinking that the pastor had been shot. And he actually followed the bad guy down after he'd shot him. The bad guy runs to the front of the church, goes into the front, and collapses. Well, the daughter has been on 911 saying, "My father's been shot. My father's been shot. Send the ambulance and police and so on and so forth." And fortunately, the pastor was smart enough to realize that the guy was no longer a threat. Put his gun in a drawer that happened to be handy, And he said that when the deputies first arrived, he said, I thought every gun in the county was pointed at me.
Well, that, of course, is why they also recommend you get a holster that you can actually reholster one-handed with, something that will stay open rather than collapsing, let's say, inside a waistband, right?
Indeed, yeah. Yes, I've had that argument with people who said, well, I don't need to be able to reholster without looking and one-handed.
Not until you're about to stare down the guns of the police department. So, let's say I'm in an open in a venue like this concert in Las Vegas or something along those lines. What can I do as precautions to keep myself safe or safer from a mass killer?
Well, the first thing is what we call situational awareness. You've got to keep your eyes open. Far too many, particularly young people these days, I've seen them walking down the street, they're talking on their cell phones, they're texting, they're paying absolutely no attention to what's going on around them. When you go into any public venue, it's a good idea to scope out the exits. If something goes wrong, and it could be, it doesn't have to be a shooting. It could be a fire. It could be an earthquake. It could be all sorts of things. But you need to scope out the exits. This is what I would do if we came under fire or where I am became dangerous. And another thing that particularly applies in this instance, the mantra even of the federal government now for civilians caught up in mass shootings is run, hide, fight. Well, in the Las Vegas case, fight is obviously inappropriate, because the guy was 400 yards away and 32 floors up in a hotel. So that's not going to work. So you're left with hide or basically run, evacuate, get out of there, of which the second is probably better. In the Pulse nightclub, we have an example where, and this was another little lesson.
Chris, I'm going to want to hear about Pulse, and I'm going to pick that up after the break. Okay, so let's pick up with Pulse because I want to hear about that one. Meanwhile, my name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. We will be returning in just a moment with Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. My name is Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Today we have as our guest Chris Bird, and we are discussing his book, Surviving a Mass Killer Rampage. We were talking about specific instances and tactics, Chris, and you started to mention the Pulse nightclub murders. Tell us about that.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make was that when you're trying to get out of there or trying to hide, the bathroom is not probably a good place to go to because there's only one exit and entrance. And at the Pulse, again, according to Sheriff Wayne Ivey, a lot of people went in there, and the killer followed them in and started murdering them. So not too many people got out of there alive. So that's something to bear in mind. Another factor, I guess, that applies to most of these venues, although mass killers may be nuts, they may be terrorists. I'm less concerned with their motives than with what they do and what we can do about it. But they almost always choose, quote, gun-free zones. Gun-free zones are a myth. Gun-free zones aren't. in the same way that in the military, friendly fire isn't, gun-free zones aren't. They're only free of law-abiding citizens
so wait,
with
I'm
the best
shocked.
means to defend themselves.
You're telling me that if I put up a gunbuster sign, you mean the mass murderers won't stay out? I'm shocked, I tell you.
That's it. They will pick that venue because they know what they're trying to do in most cases is to produce a big kill score. And to do that, they don't want to be confronted. They know eventually they will be confronted by law enforcement. But it may take anything from 5 minutes to half an hour or more, depending on where you're at. One of the first, in fact, I think the first school board to approve teachers with guns in Texas was 17 miles from the sheriff's office. So with a response time of probably half an hour, then that obviously one needs to be able to take care of oneself until the police arrive. But gun-free zones have been touted. Almost every state has a list of places where you, even if you're licensed, you can't carry a gun. Mm-hmm. These include bars, courts, public offices of some
I'm
sort.
happy to say we are working diligently at reducing that list in North Carolina. Restaurants with on-premises alcohol consumption permits are no longer on the list. Parades and funerals are no longer on the list. You're allowed a certain limited amount on educational properties, assemblies of people for which admission is charged, like theaters, all that stuff we've gotten. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is what we need to do because, unfortunately, there's a whole host of people out there that don't know a damn thing about guns, aren't interested in people taking responsibility for their own safety. And I should point out that at least twice the Supreme Court has said a police department or law enforcement agency cannot be sued for failing to protect any particular individual. And when you think about it, that makes sense because otherwise, if you could sue the police department every time you were a crime victim, your purse gets snatched or something, or you get held up, you'd sue the police department. They didn't protect me. And the whole thing would come to a grinding halt. So basically what they're saying is you are responsible for your own safety. And,
you are responsible for your own safety. That's the bottom line. Listen, Chris, we're going to have to start wrapping up. But first, why don't you tell us how we can do some shameless self-promoting here? How can we get your book?
Well, you can get it from Amazon or order it through any bookstore, or you can go to my website, chrisbird.us. chrisbird.us, and get it that way.
Awesome. Okay, folks, thank you very much, Chris, for joining us today and this essential information. In closing here, I want to remind our listeners of a few things. Back to the politics of this situation. Remember, if terrorist violence in France and elsewhere proves anything, it's that the weapons are irrelevant. They're using cargo trucks in some cases. The problem isn't the weapons used by deviants, it is the deviants themselves. Unfortunately, for 50-plus years, the left has been preaching moral relativism, that there is no absolute right or wrong, and that other cultures with fine traditions like, say, female genital mutilation or even honor killings or the stoning of women, they're saying that they're as morally viable as traditional Judeo-Christian values. In that environment, is it any surprise that deviants, whether they are terrorists or sociopaths, can justify their own morality even if it involves killing dozens or even hundreds of innocent people. So here is what I'm going to need you to do. First and foremost, do not compromise on gun control. They're going to say that this is all about bump fire mechanisms, that this current debate is, we're not infringing on the Second Amendment, but understand that back in about 2000, the gun control movement became very adept at camouflaging their agenda. When they talk about universal background checks, what they really mean is universal gun registration in order to find and eventually confiscate your firearms. When they talk about bans on a bump fire mechanism, I can guarantee you that as the legislation is written, it will include all sorts of things that are not immediately obvious, including potentially semi-automatic firearms, the cosmetic features that were banned in 1994 as part of the so-called assault weapons ban, magazine limits, you name it. Remember, this is how the state of New York got saddled with the SAFE Act and what were originally a 7-round magazine limit. Only eventually did the court throw that out in favor of an almost equally arbitrary 10-round magazine limit. So in this debate, what you need to remember is that compromise, as your opponents define it, denotes a process in which you might lose a little less than under their original proposal, but you still lose. Do not presume that this is just about nasty old bump fire systems, because that's what the left wants. What they do is to vilify one segment of gun ownership, like the assault weapon ban in 1994, so that they can play divide and conquer. After all, the hunters said, who needs those nasty old assault weapons? As though need has anything to do with your rights under the Bill of Rights. They've done this before, and they'll do it again. So what I need you to do is I need you to go join some of the true no-compromise gun rights groups like, and I'm a little biased on this one, like Grassroots North Carolina, and I especially recommend Gun Owners of America. The URLs for those are grnc.org and gunowners.org, grnc.org and gunowners.org. Finally, today I need you to call Congressman Mark Meadows immediately at 202-202-225-6401 and let him know that you appreciate his conservative positions to date, but that he needs to remember that no compromise on gun control is acceptable. Again, that number is area code 202-225-6401. With your efforts, we will be able to, hopefully, once again, defeat the gun control legislation, which will almost inevitably follow as it followed Sandy Hook in 2013 with the so-called universal background checks of Senate Bill 649, which went down in flames. My name is Paul Vallone. You've been listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com, where each Sunday at 5 p.m. as part of the Sunday Night Political Power Block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. I encourage you to check out my website at gunspoliticsandfreedom.com. Spell out that and, gunspoliticsandfreedom.com, where you can find my writing and earlier editions of this show. See you next week at 5.